Hi, this video is from March 8th, 2018. This is Class 18 of Engineering 222. A couple of announcements before we get into the recorded lecture. First of all, the homework assignment number 10, that's due on Friday, March 9th by 5 p.m. So it's in bold there just to indicate that that's a change from what was originally announced. Originally, it was announced to be due on Thursday by 9:30, but I'm giving you a little bit of extra time because one of the problems on that assignment is related to cost effectiveness analysis, which we're going over in today's video. Looking a little bit further into the future, next week you've got two things on your schedule. There's homework 11, which is related to today's lecture mostly, and also our exam. Both of those things are on Thursday, March 15th. Regarding the exam, I already mentioned this in class on Tuesday, but let me give you a reminder that there's going to be two sections of the exam. The first section is open-ended open-ended short answer, definition of terms, conceptual type questions. And on that section of the exam, you can't use any formula sheet, you can't use any of your notes. But then on the second part of the exam, where you're going to be solving problems and doing calculations, you can use a page of notes that you prepare for that. In addition to your own personally prepared page of notes and hints and whatever help you need to do the different analyses, I'm going to provide a formula sheet and factor table that's identical to what I gave you for the first exam. Also, as a reminder, please bring a computer because there will be questions related to Excel. In other words, some of the analyses we've done, such as incremental analysis or external rate of return analysis, it would be really unpleasant to do those without Excel. So bring a computer. Finally, just as a reminder, the project is due on Thursday, the 29th of March. I haven't gotten very many questions related to the project, and sometimes I use the number of questions I'm receiving as a surrogate for how many students are actually working on the project. So I'd really encourage you to get an early start on that. At the very least, you need to begin reading the assignment to see if there are things that you don't understand that you need to have clarified. But that will be collected Thursday, the 29th of March. You'll upload it to MU Online before class on that day, so keep that in mind. Okay, today's lecture has two parts. In the first section, we're going to be talking about cost effectiveness analysis, and that's a way of doing decision making to identify which offices or which alternatives are being the most efficient. And then in the second part of our lecture, we're going to be looking at how you analyze equipment and whether it's time to replace equipment or how long it should be maintained versus purchasing new equipment. And so that type of analysis is sometimes called economic service life. As a reminder, this lecture was mostly recorded in a previous semester, so there may be some incidental references to times or dates that don't quite add up. Just keep in mind that the announcements that are on this slide are the ones that govern for the course. And if you have any questions about the material or about the announcements, please feel free to send me an email and I'll do my best to respond.
Last time we were doing incremental analysis of the benefits. Let me dim the lights so it's a little bit easier to see the screen here. This isn't the exact spreadsheet that I showed last time. I created the one from last time sort of on the fly from scratch, and this is a solution I have from a previous semester, but it's the same answers and it's following mostly the same procedure. So we were presented with 4 alternatives, and we were trying to figure out, if we've got an option that you can get for $3 million, why would you spend $9 million? And the question is, are you getting even more benefits than that incremental cost between alternatives? And so the first thing that we did here in this middle group of numbers is we just evaluated them according to benefit cost just to see if any one of them should be eliminated outright. Like if any of them are unacceptable because the costs outweigh the benefits. And what we saw is that none of them could be immediately rejected. And we also noticed that of these alternatives, option B had the highest B to C ratio. But that could give you the wrong idea, in the same way that you can get the wrong idea just by looking at interest rates, internal rate of return, comparing projects. You can't compare projects on the basis only of their B to C ratios, and so that's why we do the incremental analysis. And so the interpretation of B versus A is you're just looking at how much more expensive is B compared to A, and how much more benefits are there, what are the differences in disbenefits, and so on. And so you calculate the change between the two alternatives, and then you put the change of each of these categories into the conventional B to C ratio formula. And so this 2.57, the interpretation of that is that for every additional dollar of cost for project B, because it is more expensive, for each additional dollar of cost, you get $2.57 of benefit. And so should we do it? Absolutely. It's like you're spending $1 to get $2.57 in return. I think any of us would make that exchange. When we compare, and so now B is what we would stick with instead of A. B is sort of our current favorite. Our next comparison to the next most expensive alternative after B was C, but we reject that alternative because you only get 96 cents worth of benefit for every dollar of cost. And so the final comparison of D isn't against the one that we've just rejected, because we've just said C is a no-go. And so the final comparison is between D and the most recent yes before that, which is B. And so the $1.12, that ratio is above 1, which tells us go for the more expensive alternative. So are there any questions on this process of incremental B to C analysis? By the way, I apologize for how muggy it is in here. I don't know what the story is with that. It's sort of like a jungle. And I turned down the AC, but I don't know if that's going to do any good. In this class, occasionally we're going to talk about ethics. And part of the reason for that is that in engineering economy, as a discipline, there are some qualitative factors to it that are as much an art as a science. And you have to rely on professional experience and make judgments that affect a wide range of people. And the judgments that you make sometimes are based on non-quantitative factors. And so this is one of the first times we'll sort of look at some of the principles that people should keep in mind when they're making decisions based on economic analysis. And it's not just engineers that face these kinds of decisions. People in safety fields have to balance the risk versus reduction in profit for a company. When you're telling a company what money they should spend and which risk mitigation techniques they should use, all of those things cost money, and so you're balancing the value of human life and the value of human safety versus a reduction in profits. And the same thing is true in computer science, when you're balancing privacy and a whole host of issues versus profits. And so ethics should always be in the back of our mind. Now, we don't just do quantitative and technical work. People in our fields are often called to play decision-making roles in public policy and planning for projects. And so these affect a broad range of people. And when you go through the decision-making process, we have to be impartial, meaning that if you're working for a let's say an agency that's going to be making a decision on contracts, then that decision on contracts shouldn't be based on who is your friend or who have you worked for in the past, but obviously should be based on who gives the most competitive bid and who it looks like is going to give the highest quality results to the stakeholders. Realistic is mentioned here because there's sort of a dirty history in engineering economy of people making unrealistic assumptions on purpose because they wanted a project to go forward. They wanted, engineers love to build, for example. And so the only reason that you get to build is if there's a need and some sort of a justified need. And so in the past, there were companies and even federal agencies that would do these analyses and have unrealistic expectations about interest rates, for example, and how long projects would last and how much they would get used, just to make the conditions look like a project is justified. And then once it looks like the project is justified, then everyone eats. The engineers get to have plenty of work, so they're making a profit. And so we can't let go of realism just so that a project can go forward. And then the last part here, thorough in a wide range of circumstances, means that we should be We should be attuned to the possibilities that sometimes things turn out as you don't expect. Like you have to plan a project not just for one interest rate, but look at the whole spectrum of possibilities of financing interest rates, or the performance of a contractor, what the quality of their work may be. You know, if you're expecting a contractor to always do the perfect work and, for instance, concrete strengths to be at the far end of what's possible, then that could really lead to some bad results. And the book talks in a lot of detail and offers some interesting examples about each one of these, but the bottom line is that when you do economic analysis, there's some leeway there for interpretation and setting the conditions of the analysis. And once you start the calculations, everything's very straightforward, but oftentimes when you're saying, well, let's assume 5% interest, you know, that starting point is going to affect all the calculations later on. And that's where these ethical considerations usually have their origin, is at the beginning underlying assumptions that you begin your analysis with for a project. And so here are some rhetorical questions. I think that the answer to each of these will be obvious, but they get asked because in the past, people have violated what seems obvious to us. So for instance, to accept publicly funded projects where the benefits are excluded to certain people. And so, you know, there have been a lot of places in the world where there's been racial discrimination or economic discrimination where only a certain class of people got to enjoy benefits that were supposedly state-funded, and because they're state-funded, they should be open to everyone. Some people worry about the debt that you guys are going to face. Your generation didn't make any of the decisions about what the federal deficit should be spent on. And all of the borrowing that's been going on until now, there's this enormous bill that eventually is going to have to be paid. And the debt adds to the amount of taxes that people have to pay. And so sometimes people worry about the ethical implications of just sort of kicking the can down the road and saying, well, we'll let the next generation worry about global warming, or we'll let the next generation worry about crumbling infrastructure. We won't make the hard choices today, but we'll just sort of put that off for later. I spoke about this earlier, the idea of projects where the poor or minorities are disproportionately disbenefited. When we were talking about where a road goes, you know, oftentimes it's suggested to put interstate highways through poor areas because land is cheaper in poor areas. But then another part of that is just that poor people are in less of a position to put up a fight because they can't hire lawyers to the same extent that if the highway was going through a rich neighborhood, then people could afford lawyers to represent them and to fight that off. The noise effects in poor areas are less expensive to mitigate because people aren't going to fight as hard during the public meeting stages. And so obviously that sort of thing isn't ethical, to sort of target disbenefits to people who can't fight back or can't represent their own interests. Monetizing projects is where we're trying to assign a dollar value to things that maybe don't naturally have a dollar value. And so the cost of construction is easy to say what the dollar value of that. It's a little bit more challenging to say what's the dollar value of sitting in traffic because of a traffic jam. We can do it, but it requires a little bit of creativity. But now think about air pollution. How do you quantify the dollar value of emitting air pollution, or how much a company should be charged for polluting the air? It's really hard to say. And so there are certain things that companies are used to not having to pay for at all. For example, minimum wage positions often don't have any kind of benefits, no health benefits, no retirement benefits. And so companies that rely on a lot of part-time employees are essentially shifting the burden for health care and retirement costs to someone else. You know, they're saying, we'll just let the government cover that. Medicaid, we'll let the hospital's emergency fund cover that. And so that's an example of externalizing costs that maybe isn't ethical. We just have to ask that question. And the last thing is that sometimes we ignore problems that are hard to solve. You know, we love the problems that are easy to solve just because it makes us feel smart. But if a problem is challenging to understand, or it's really complicated, or it's going to take a long time, then there's just human nature to try and ignore that. And I think you know, these types of treaties that take lots of countries to agree, and then it's only when everyone agrees and everyone does it to get the benefit at the end, those are the kinds that are really challenging to implement. And so the same thing can be true in engineering economy. Sometimes we will have alternatives that are easy for us to put into a spreadsheet, and so we'll do those calculations and we'll kind of start loving those alternatives because we put together a nice spreadsheet for it. But there may be other options that are less attractive to us just because they're unfamiliar or it's more challenging to quantify the benefits. And so we should avoid situations where we become biased just because of our affinity for quantifiable data. So that's just to put in the back of your mind. We'll spend a little bit more time going into ethics in a future class, but since we had a little bit of extra time today, I want to introduce those ideas. Now, we're moving away from B2C analysis, which was one of our first methods for choosing among alternatives when you have cost only, meaning projects that you don't expect are going to generate sizable revenues. Here's another method for trying to choose from among alternatives, and this is even simpler than B2C analysis, because in benefit cost analysis, we're comparing the different benefits that each project can provide, and we're comparing differences in cost. In cost effectiveness analysis, we're saying all of the alternatives that we're comparing have the same benefit, and we're only focusing on differences in costs. Now, the types of places where we may need to apply this are government projects, but it's more specific than that. This cost effectiveness analysis is usually applied in the service sector of public projects. And so services are different than physical things that are constructed, you know, like a dam or a road or a bridge. Those are all public service projects, but they're not tangible. These are, what we're going to be talking about today, are intangible, so services. Examples of intangible things that are provided by the public sector would be healthcare, accounting, police, financial services. And so government does many of these things, and the benefits aren't physical of those. But there are benefits. Just the fact that it doesn't exist as a physical thing doesn't mean it doesn't have a benefit. And so let's take, for example, traffic cameras. It can be challenging to quantify the benefits of traffic cameras. And so that's part of the reason why we wouldn't use B2C analysis is, now how do you know the dollar value of traffic cameras? You know, we can use the cameras that are up at an intersection for potentially giving people tickets who run a red light, or we can use it just to try and predict where traffic flows are congested and have people avoid congested intersections, you know, so rerouting. But assigning a dollar value to that is kind of a tricky thing. The same thing is true for police work. You know, you can't say what's the economic benefit of having an officer on the street. As they're going about their shift, maybe they prevent a crime, maybe they help get a cat down out of the tree, I don't know. You know, police officers do a wide range of things, but assigning a dollar value to each one of the tasks that they do through the day is maybe a little bit unrealistic. And so what we're going to do instead in cost effectiveness analysis is just look at costs rather than trying to focus on the benefits. So here's the formula for the cost effectiveness analysis. It's basically the cost effectiveness ratio. That's what the R stands for, is ratio. In the numerator, you have all of the costs of some activity, whatever service is being provided. And so the costs may include like salaries. It could include the utility costs or vehicle costs, rents of an office being up and running. And in the denominator, we'll have some sort of a measure of productivity. So in the case of a police officer, it could be the number of speeding tickets written during a month. If you think about accounting, it could be the number of tax returns processed in a week. If we're talking about healthcare, it could be the number of patients that a nurse is providing services to during a shift. So it's just however, whatever the main job tasks are for this organization or individual, we measure how effectively they do it and we put it in the denominator. And so this ratio, what do you think you'd like? The ratio to be high or the ratio to be low? When you're doing an analysis like this and you're trying to pick from among alternatives, do you want the alternative with the highest ratio or the alternative with the lowest ratio? Lowest. Why would we want the ratio to be the lowest?
Because that means more effective.
Right. So what you want to do is you want to maximize effectiveness and minimize costs. So we'll look at an illustration of that. Let's take, for instance, what if we had some government office that's processing passport applications? You can send off a passport application to Charleston, South Carolina. Depending on where you live, it may go to New Orleans or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco. So there's different offices that are all doing the same thing. They're looking at your pictures, looking up your background information, and issuing a passport. If you have capital rationing, meaning there's some sort of a budget limit, the $1,600 per hour is capital rationing. You can't have all of these offices operating at once because if you add up their operation costs, it's going to exceed the amount of money that's available. We've only got $1,600 per hour that we can spend. And so what we want to do is we want to spend the money where it matters the most. And so we have to figure out how efficient is each of these offices at what they're doing. So the data that we have for these 4 offices is how much it costs to operate them, and that can be a reflection of their office space expenses. It could be the salaries in that location and lots of other factors. We've just added them all together with the costs. So you can see that's abbreviated with C. And then here we have a measure of effectiveness, which is how many applications they process every month. Now at first glance it may look like Office C is the best because it's processing the most applications per month. But they also have the highest operational costs. So we don't yet have it compared on an apples-to-apples basis where we can look and see who's doing the best work. It's here in column 4 where we calculate costs relative to expenses that we can start to see the picture a little more clearly. Once we calculate that, it looks like whoever has the lowest C to E ratio is Office B. They are, now the interpretation of this, the units get a little bit weird because in the numerator was dollars per hour and in the denominator is applications per month. So don't worry necessarily about what these units represent, but what you should keep in mind is that the lowest is always the best here. And so the lowest one is Office B, which is 5.1 cents. In terms of dollars per hour per application per month. And so what we could do now is we can sort it between here and here. I'm simply putting the cheapest one first, and so that would be our first priority, is to give money to Office B. Because we've got limited budget, we should fund them all the way. And then our second best option is Office A, because they're spending 6.3 cents for the same work that Office B does for 5.1 cents. And now this final column 5 is the cumulative cost. Remember, we have to keep in mind the $1,600 per hour, and so if we're only choosing option B, then we're spending $450 per hour. But then if we also are funding Office A, then it would be the total cumulative cost would be the cost of Office B and the cost of Office A together, which is $1,325. And so $1,600 per hour means that we should definitely do B and A. And in some cases, you can partially fund the next alternative. So we could say any leftover money between $1,325 and $1,600, we'd take that leftover money and partially fund option C. Sometimes partial funding is an alternative, sometimes it's not. Again, this budget limit is sometimes called capital rationing, where you want to spend your limited dollars on whichever office or alternative is going to provide the best value. Any questions about the method? All right, here is the in-class exercise for today. Now, I suggested that you should bring your computers. This one you probably can do without a computer if you don't have one, although, you know, it's going to be a lot of number crunching with the calculator. So this one is about poaching, and there are 5 different NGOs, which is a non-governmental organization that is trying to prevent poaching of endangered gorillas. And so we've got a certain budget, and we need to find out where to spend that limited budget. This is a little bit different from the example I just showed you, because the total costs aren't given directly. I've provided some information that you need to use to calculate the total costs, but the costs aren't just given outright. There's 2 there. Does everybody have a copy of the paper? Okay, so here's the formula, the cost-effectiveness ratio formula. We know for each of these alternatives how many people they've got, what their salaries are. So you're going to use that for understanding their total costs. And then the effectiveness here, we want to maximize the number of poachers that get arrested. And so you can see each year the number of poachers that they've been arresting. So for step A, calculate the CER for each of the alternatives based on the total costs, and then rank them in terms of who's the most effective to the least effective, and then apply the budget limit of $5 million to decide if no partial funding is allowed, then who should be funded. Excel has a nice tool that allows you to rank a list. If we select, for example, we want to have from lowest to highest based here, And we could go here to, there it is, sort, smallest to largest. Yeah, expand. I think if we say expand, it's going to include these other cells to the left of it. And so now we've got C at the top because it has the lowest, and then A is next, and the worst is D. Who knows what those guys at Gorilla Watch are doing? So what these all represent is this would be the number of dollars in salary they're paying each year for each poacher that's arrested. And so we need to have a final column that's the cumulative cost. And so the first year is just going to be the program cost of option C. Then the next one is going to be the previous program's cost plus the cost of the next one. So A is helping hands, so the sum of those two together, and we can just drag this down. So if we were going to try and fund all of them, it would take $7.3 million. But in the example, we have a $5 million limit, and it says no partial funding. And so who would we fund? Well, we would have to say yes to the first couple, and then no to the others. And so these guys would be a yes, yes, yes. But we can't fund these guys because the cumulative cost exceeds the budget. And so the anticipated poachers to be arrested if the past data is any guide, then what we will end up with, we'll just total the three that are funding. So we would add these three together, and we can expect to have 495 poachers arrested for the $5 million that we spend. Today we're going to be talking about decisions on when something should be replaced. And I have a couple of pictures to illustrate three cases in particular that we need to be considered with. Now, probably everybody here has driven a car before, and I don't think any of us has the newest, nicest car that's being made. We all have compromises. Although it'd be fun to have a brand new Lexus every year, you know, we drive what we've got because we're getting value out of it, and it continues to have a certain amount of life. And maybe cars that are sold today, what would you say is a general expectation of how long they're going to last?
5 years.
5 years, and then it's out to the dump? I don't know. I've got higher hopes than that on a car. 5 years is a pretty common financing timeline, though. But it seems like, well, the car that I drive is a 2001, so it's already 15 years old, right? So I don't drive anything new or nice. It's 15 years old. Anybody here drive a car older than 2001? And then what happened? The engine decided to stop working. And so she was faced with the question of, do you pay for repairs on a car that's already 19 years old, or do you get something new? And so this first instance of when to replace an item is when it begins to have reduced performance. And specifically, you may be facing repairs that are required that outweigh maybe the costs that you face if you replace the item. Now, one of the most common fallacies out there is people sometimes say, well, it cost me more to fix it than it's worth. And that's absolutely the wrong way to look at it. So let's say that you have a car that's worth $1,000, and you can repair it for $1,100, and it'll run for another 2 years. So what you're saying is you can get 2 years of transportation for $1,100, and there's no new car out there in the world that you're going to get 2 years of capital recovery for $1,100. And so I just wanted to point out to begin with that that's something that you hear again and again, sometimes from mechanics, sometimes from people who are going to the mechanic, that, you know, there's this supposed crossover point that you'd never want to spend more on repairs than the vehicle is worth. And that's not true. But what you do have to consider is how does the replacement compare to the current item and the performance it can deliver and the cost of ownership, including maintenance, fuel economy. And then there's another fallacy that sometimes people will talk about is, well, I have a job in Charleston, so I have to buy a Prius, a new Prius, because my current car only gets 38 miles per gallon, and if I get a Prius, it gets 52 miles per gallon. And so I think you'd have to probably drive 50,000 miles a year for that incremental improvement in fuel economy to justify a whole new vehicle. So you have to be a lot more comprehensive in your analysis than just sort of these knee-jerk suppositions that repairs or fuel economy is really the thing that you have to buy a new car for. So obviously I'm an advocate of keeping a car as long as it makes economic sense, because mine is 15 years old right now. So over time, let's say that something is breaking down a lot and maybe you're missing work for it or coming late to class because of your unreliable car. Well, you have to have those costs factor in to the total cost of ownership. So what is your convenience worth? Is it so important that you be somewhere on time that you're willing to buy a new car for it? Or could you just buy like a AAA membership for $40 a year, and if you break down, have them tow it to the shop? You know, a AAA membership is always going to be cheaper than a new car. So here I am trying to sell you on the idea of keeping an old car for a long time. But eventually, you may not be able to buy the parts you need any longer, or the cumulative cost of your inconvenience and the time in the repair shop and the actual repairs themselves outweighs the cost of replacing a vehicle. So that's one way that we would justify replacing something that we already own. Because the cheapest alternative is always the do-nothing approach, like status quo. Keep the item you've already got is going to be a really good baseline alternative. However, sometimes what you need to do can no longer be accomplished with the equipment you already own. And the picture that's shown here is taken from a steel mill where certain classifications of steel that are more common now in construction can't be produced by older temperature furnaces. And I don't know all the specific details about it, but there are older furnaces from like 20 or 25 years ago that simply aren't able to achieve the higher temperatures required for certain grades of steel. So that if the market is shifting and your company needs to do something that can't be accomplished by the old equipment, then that may be a situation where you face no alternative, that you can't make repairs, or you can't put up with inconvenience like maybe you could in case one. You're simply, the change in requirements for what's being produced forces you in a certain direction. Now, sometimes people think that computers are a situation of altered requirements. But that's not necessarily true, because the basic things that we do with computers have not changed very much in the last 10 years, and maybe you could say even in the last 20 years. Writing documents with a word processor, using spreadsheets. I mean, spreadsheets go back into the early 80s. Internet browsing and email is a little bit older, but there was internet and there was email even 20 years ago. And so it's not a situation of altered requirements that maybe would want you to replace a computer, but it's a perception of obsolescence. Now, pictured on the screen here is an Apple II, and this is the computer that I learned my first programming on when I was going to middle school back in 1988. That's how old I am. I was in middle school in 1988. So we used an Apple IIe. You can see that this has the 2 floppy disks, which is pretty great, 5 1/4 inch. So you've got 2, you can make copies of all your games, because there's no such thing as copy protection, anything like that. Monochrome monitor, black and green, so it's got 2 colors instead of just 1. It was pretty basic, and the keyboard was awful, had a really bad feel to it. It was slow. I think the processor in that is certainly less than 4 megahertz, which is the processor that I had in my home computer at home. I thought like I was superior to those school computers because my processor was faster at 4 megahertz. But so let's look at why would you replace something like this. It's not necessarily that it can't do the task anymore, because there are spreadsheet programs for the Apple II, and I could do basically everything we've done in this class, all of the calculations, I could do on an old-style spreadsheet program. But it would be a lot less convenient. It's easier to do things now with maybe a touch screen or with a mouse. That didn't have a mouse, by the way, so that was a challenge. So it's just the improved performance and the new things that you can do, or the speed at which you can do them, that would argue in favor of replacement. Not necessarily that it can't do it, it's just that it doesn't do it as well as the competition. So any questions about these ideas? Here's a graphical representation of something that's really important. And sometimes in quizzes and exams, I'll ask students to describe what's happening with the picture. You know, tell me a story of what is this representing? What are the concepts behind this? And so let me tell you about it. On the horizontal axis, you can see is time, number of years. And so are you going to own something for a long time, like your car for 15 years? Or are you going to own something for just a short period of time and then keep replacing it over and over again? There are certain people who will buy a new car every 3 years, sell the old one, get a new one. And of course, when you sell a car after 3 years, it still has plenty of residual value. So it's not like they're driving it into the dump and walking away. It's just that everybody knows that depreciation is the loss of value. And they say that as soon as you drive your car off the lot, it's already lost maybe 20% of its value. And that's probably an exaggeration. But the point is that the value of vehicles decreases a lot at first, but then the value of vehicles towards the end of the life decreases much more slowly. So here on this axis is time. And capital recovery is the curve that talks about the ownership cost from the first purchase relative to the salvage value. It takes those two things into account. We've talked about capital recovery. I've defined it previously, but just to recap for you, capital recovery is looking at the first cost, which would be, for instance, the price you pay for a car at a lot, and then also the salvage value, and then it's taking it to an annual basis. And so it's not just that this is high because it's only considering the purchase price, but you're actually annualizing the effect of those two things. So you're saying, I know I'm going to pay $30,000 for a car today, and I'm going to sell it for $3,000 10 years from now. So over those 10 years, what's the annual cost of those two things combined together? So that's what this capital recovery curve is. And you can see that the longer you own something, the capital recovery curve keeps getting lower and lower because you're spreading those expenses out over a larger period of time. However, what begins to go up over time is the annual operating costs, AOC. Why do you suppose that the annual operating costs are going up the longer you own something? I couldn't make that out. What's that? More things go wrong. Exactly right. I was driving to the airport one time in my 15-year-old car. And you know, when you're driving to the airport, you always think, boy, it'd be awful if my car broke down right now, right? I've thought that plenty of times, and then it happens to me. My car started surging a little bit, so I pulled over, and I just thought, oh, this is not happening. Because like usual, I hadn't left enough time to get to the airport, you know, waving down a taxi or something. There's no taxis on I-64. So I crossed my fingers, turned it off, turned it on again, and I was able to limp to the airport. Eventually I had to replace some sort of little servo or switch or something, but I can attest to the fact that things go wrong more often the longer you own it. And so that's why these annual operating costs are going up over time. And so the blue line is combining the two things together. The blue line represents the sum of the capital recovery and the annual operating costs. And obviously what you want to do is you want to minimize your costs. Over here on the vertical axis is the total, it's the annual worth of costs, dollars per year. And so the blue line is total, and you want to spend as little as possible on your car or any other piece of equipment. And so you should own something for as many years as corresponds to the lowest annual worth of the ownership costs. And so that sweet spot is right here in this case. So you don't want to be putting in so much money for repairs when you could get something new and the total annualized cost would be lower. So again, this is called the economic service life. The definition of that number of years is the economic service life, and it's minimizing the total annual worth of the costs. So some terminology. When you are doing a replacement study, the current best alternative, which is what you have, is considered the defender. The challenger is the potential replacement that you're considering. Now today we're not going to be comparing alternatives, we're just going to be analyzing one. But on Monday we are going to be comparing alternatives and deciding which one to choose. Market value is similar to salvage value, except for that salvage value implies it's at the end of the useful life of the item. So if we say the salvage value of the car, what we're really talking about is its scrap value. But the market value of a car may be its value on the resale market at any time prior to its end of life. So a car that you've owned for 3 years will have a higher market value than the salvage value at the end of its useful life. Now we've just talked about economic service life, or ESL. It is the amount of time that corresponds to the lowest annual worth of costs. And the defender, when you are analyzing the item that you already own against something else, there is a cost of keeping the current item. You know, an opportunity cost of keeping your current equipment is the fact that you're not selling it. And so you have to use the current market value for an existing item as its first cost when you're comparing alternatives. And then the challenger's first cost would just be the purchase price. Now, sunk costs, I don't want to focus on too much today. We'll talk more about sunk costs, but it's just the idea that you've already spent a lot of money on an existing item, but you need to ignore sunk costs when you're comparing alternatives. And that's sometimes a problem when people are selling their car online and they have like a personal attachment to it. They'll tell you a whole long story about how they replaced the brakes 3 months ago, and then they had to put on a new tire 2 months before that, and they kind of want to tell you about the recent work that's been done, but that's irrelevant to you, the buyer, because you're just looking at a car in a current condition, and you don't care about its past history because it's kind of assumed that every vehicle is going to have brakes and tires. And so the person who's selling that car has to just sort of think of those as sunk costs that can't be included in a comparison of alternatives, like choosing which car to buy. Okay, so here's today's in-class exercise, and this is just an analysis of one alternative. If you've got a computer, that'll come in very useful for today's in-class exercise, so go ahead and get it out, fire up Excel. If you don't have a computer, there are 3 of these available up at the front, so please grab one of those. What's on the screen right now is a piece of equipment that's $20,000 if we buy it at year 0, and we've got interest rates of 10%. These are showing the resale costs, the resale value, and the operating costs for the year in question. So in year 1, if we sell this item after only 1 year of operation, what we paid $20,000 for to begin with, we can get $10,000 back. The operating cost during that year is $5,000. In year 2, as you might expect, the resale value of it is a little bit lower. And so now our market value is only $8,000 and the operating costs have gone up. So wouldn't that argue in favor of just only keeping it 1 year if the market value is decreasing and the operating costs are going up? Why should we even consider owning it for more than 1 year if both of these factors kind of show that it's losing value and it's becoming more costly. Any ideas about that? Why? Is there something else that's not yet shown on the screen that would maybe cause us to consider owning it for more than 1 year? How much you paid? Okay. You're headed in the right direction. Exactly. What you save by not buying another vehicle, because if you only keep it for 1 year, at the end of that year, you're going to have to get something else. And so that's a huge added expense compared to just going with it for another year and losing that $2,000 in salvage value or market value and paying a little more for operating costs. Those may be much smaller than replacing it with a whole new expensive item. Right. So go to MU Online, and there is a spreadsheet template there on our class page for MU Online. You can get the template, and rather than have you spend the first 10 minutes of class just formatting columns and setting stuff up, I've sort of sped that process up a bit. Here's one more computer. Is there anybody who doesn't have a computer right now? Does everybody have a computer? You do? Is there anybody who doesn't have a computer? Oh, that one's not working? Yeah. I'll type that in for you. All right. There we go. Oh. Well, it's not the administrator account. Let's switch to a different user. There we go. Okay, so go to MU Online and get the template file. I got to say that in my past experience, the spreadsheet that we're making today is one of the more challenging for students to understand. And so it's really, really important that when I'm explaining certain columns, that you stop the work that you're doing and you listen to the explanation. Otherwise, you may end up getting the numbers, but you'd never be able to repeat it. So let's go to MU Online. Engineering 221, and it's down at the bottom of the content page, this in-class exercise template, and just download it. I think the touchpad doesn't work on one of those. Either of you have the one with a bad touchpad? No? All right. Okay, so does everybody have this, the template file? I'm looking. It seems like people have got them. Okay. The formulas for each column are on the page. And the grader on some of your homework assignments, when you're doing a spreadsheet, I think in some cases the grader has said that you need to explain your work and say what's gone into each column, for example. And so here's an example of what I mean by that. You can see that each column has a label like A, B, C, D, and then here below the table is an explanation of what's in each column or how you calculate it. And so it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't need to be a paragraph or anything, but just saying, for example, that column E is going to be the payment function of column D. Just sort of these really basic guides so that your work is easier to interpret. Okay, so let's zoom in here. This is all the given data from the problem statement. This thing costs $20,000 to begin with, and so we're using the negative value there to represent costs. Interest rates are 10%, so 0.1 is what we use for I. And then we've got the time, market value over time, and then the operating costs. Okay, so the first thing we need to do in column D is find the present value of the cumulative operating costs to date. So cumulative means that you include this year and all the years before it. So in year one, your operating costs are only $5,000. But in year two, your cumulative operating costs are the $5,000 you paid at the end of year one and the $6,500 that you paid at the end of year two. So, by extension, cumulative for year three means the $8,000 and the costs above it. So cumulative is one part of it, but then the other part of it is the present value of those cumulative amounts. So these amounts are in year 1, 2, 3, and so on. They're not in the present. So we have to use a function that will take them to the present and add them all together once they get to the present. And as you can see here from this little guide, we're going to use the NPV function of the range so far. So what I mean is, for year one, it's the NPV of this. For year two, it'll be the NPV of these 2 years. And the NPV function works perfect for us because these are already not in the future. This is in year one, this is in year two, and so on. None of these amounts are in year zero for the operating costs. And so you can do NPV, and then it's asking for rate, so you click on the interest rate, and then comma, and just all of the values that are accumulating for the year until where you're at. And right now we're in year one, so it's just going to be that first one. Close parentheses, enter. So what does that amount mean? The $4,545. That means if you take the operating costs that are paid at the end of year one, if you take them to the present, then that amount in year zero is equivalent $4,545. All right, so then for year two, we're going to do the NPV function again. The rate is still 10%, comma, and then the range is going to be the 2 years of operating costs that have been experienced so far. Close parentheses. Actually, you don't even need close parentheses. Excel knows that it should be there, and it just figures it out. All right? So 9,917 is the cumulative. Now, if you add these two numbers together, you know that 5,000 plus 6,500, that's 11,500, right? But this is saying take those amounts in the year that they're in and take it to year zero. So this was at year one, and that was at year two. This is the equivalent sum of those two amounts at the present. So now do the same thing for the other years as well. You can't drag the function down. Unfortunately, you have to type the function in repeatedly for this one. It doesn't work to just drag it down. Okay, so has everybody got it? Any questions so far? Okay. So if we keep the item for 5 years and we operate it for those 5 years, if you took all the operating costs to year zero, then the present value equivalent of those annual operating costs would be $30,178. So that means if you put $30,178 into the bank, and the account is paying 10% interest, then you'd have enough in that account that you could continually draw from that account and pay these operating costs over the 5-year time frame. And at the end, after paying the $12,500, then that account would be empty. That's the interpretation of that $30,178. All right, now annual worth of operating costs. So here's the operating costs at year 0, and what we want to do is spread it out over the number of years of ownership. So it's an equal payment every year instead of, this is going up continually. It's hard for a lot of businesses to handle variable costs, and so they want to smooth expenses over time. And so, in fact, the power company does that. There are programs where you can sign up to pay the same electricity amount through the whole year, because a lot of people don't like it when their electrical bills skyrocket during the summer because of a lot more air conditioning. And so there's these leveling programs to try and take the variability of expenses out. And in column E, what we're doing is we're saying, instead of paying a different amount every year, how much would it cost if we paid the same amount for our annual operating costs every year? And so the function we're going to use for that, as it says here in the little key, we're going to use the payment function, and D is going to be the amount that's at the present we use for the payment function. So equals PMT. Our rate is 10%. We want to anchor it. This one we can drag the function down. We don't have to type it in lots of times, and so it's important for us to anchor the functions if we're planning to do that. N, we don't want to anchor N because for each row it's going to be a different number of years of ownership. So I'll just click on the year for N. Now, this is where we sometimes have to be careful, because we could either put the amount as a present value or as a future value. So this right now is at the present, so we'll click on it here and then also put in that minus there to make sure that it doesn't change the sign, as Excel sometimes does, and click enter. Now let's see, yeah, I think that's it. Now so far it's pretty anticlimactic, because all it's done is it's moved that 4,545 from year 1 back to year 0. But if you drag that function down, then it's actually doing some useful work for the other amounts. Because what it's saying now is, let's say you own the item for 2 years. Instead of paying $5,000 the first year and then $6,500 the second year, what you could do is you could pay $5,714 into an account during those 2 years, and there would be economic equivalence between the two if the account is paying 10% interest. So it's not as easy as just adding these two together and dividing by 2, because they're in different years, and we have to account for the time value of money. So that's why we take this approach of annualizing the costs, taking the interest rate into account. Okay, so column F is we're just taking the first cost and spreading it out over how many years we're going to own it. So it's the payment function again, PMT, where we're using the rate, anchor that. N is whatever row we're on for the number of years. And then it is a present value. The first cost is at year 0, so we're going to put in the present value field, that first cost, and anchoring it, and then the negative sign, just because Excel annoyingly changes the sign on things. All right, so if you pay at the end of year 1, then it's going to be $22,000, because it was $20,000 at year 0, and you've got 10% interest. And so it's going to be more costly to pay at the end of the first year than to pay at time 0. And we drag that down, and it's finding out, for instance, if you keep it for 5 years, what is the cost you have to pay every year instead of the first cost all at once. Okay, the annual worth of the market value is different than what we did in column F, because the market value is in the future. It's not at the present. This 10,000, 8,000, 6,000, These are amounts at the end of the number of years that you'll get for selling the item. So when we do the payment function, the rate is still going to be 10%, and the n is going to be the year that we're on. But now we need to skip over the present value field, because this market value isn't at time 0. It's at the end of the cash flow diagram. So skip over the present value field, and now it's a future value that we'll click on the market value, and you find out if you move it to however many years you're having, what's the annual value of the market value. So for instance, instead of taking 8,000 at the end of year 2, that's the same as taking 3,810 at the end of year 1, and then the same amount at the end of year 2. So you're spreading out the value of reselling the item evenly over a certain number of years. I mean, column H is just add these two together. F plus G. And the purpose of column I is to demonstrate that actually we can put a present value and a future value into the same function. So watch this. If we say PMT, and then we refer to the interest rate and anchor it, and N is the number of years corresponding to what row we're on. Now, in the formula, next it wants to know the present value. The present value is the first cost, so I'm going to put a negative sign there because of the whole situation. Okay, first cost, and I'm going to anchor that because it's always going to be the same first cost, and then comma, now it's asking for the future value. The future value is the market value of the item. So I'm going to put negative and of the future value for the row that we're on. And so in a single formula, it's handling both the present and the future value and getting the same thing as if we had calculated them separately and then combined them. You can do either approach on a homework or exam. It wouldn't be necessary to have both of these columns together. So this alternate method is just to illustrate that one function can have two input values, a present and a future value. Okay, the last thing, the total annual worth of costs. Down here in the key, it's saying column E plus column I. So total costs are operating plus the capital recovery. And capital recovery accounts for the purchase price and the ultimate market value together. So the total costs are going to be the operating costs, annual worth, and either column H or column I. Since they're identical, it doesn't matter which one we do. So when we drag that down, it tells us our costs depending on how long we own the thing. Here on the template it asks how many years is the lowest cost. So it looks like this is the lowest cost. I can bold that. Look over here. It is 3 years. So what's the significance of the lowest annual cost? What's the interpretation of that? That's right. That's how long you should own the item. You should own this item for 3 years and then get rid of it. Why not keep it for longer? It'll cost you more. If you keep it for 3 years, then the annual cost for each of those 3 years is $12,634. If you keep it for 4, then it would be $12,950 for each of those 4 years. So it seems like whatever combination of reduced salvage value and increased operating costs are conspiring together to make it so that it actually starts to become more expensive to own. So be sure on the spreadsheet that you've just created, it's not enough to have these numbers. You should also write a note to yourself on how to interpret this, what it all means, because sometimes that's the easy thing to forget is the significance of what these numbers represent. and how to apply the criteria for the analysis to the data. So on the exam, for example, I'll be delighted if your spreadsheet's correct, but I don't want to go hunting for the right answer in your spreadsheet. You should say specifically, like a conclusion at the bottom here. So I'm going to say, so in conclusion, we should own the item for 3 years. And then the rationale for that is it has the lowest total annual worth of costs. And then that reminds us when we come back to it later what the judgment was and how we arrived at that particular decision.